Alright, so first up, just a few cool things that I was able to see when zipping around the camera around the Playtime Company factory here. Firstly, taking the camera just outside the factory where you first start the chapter, I was surprised to see that lettering for Playtime Co. can be seen on the roof. This is pretty standard for a factory, I suppose, but what makes this interesting is that you can never normally see this from the inside. So, either maybe at one point in development, the plan was for the player to see the factory from the outside at some point, or the developers just went out of their way to make a cool little detail that not many people were gonna see. Then, also in the lobby here, in the corner is the stand for the VCR player, and if we take the camera below it, we can see two more of them just stacked up here. I guess the developers just forgot to delete these. It's kinda weird. What's even weirder though in the main foyer is what's seen if we take the camera just below the two posters going down each of the two side hallways here. Under both of these are some hidden creepy pictures of various people with their faces all scribbled out. Now, I haven't seen anyone else talk about these, so I'm not sure if they're part of some side Easter egg or anything, but yeah, they just all appear to be staff photos or something. I'm not sure if these are pictures of the devs or employees of Playtime Co., but regardless, seeing their faces maliciously scribbled out like this is pretty unsettling. Then moving along to this main hub-like area where you first encounter the large huggy fella, there are several doors that we normally never get to enter. Although the power door leads to another room, I know when playing this chapter for the first time myself, I was really curious as to what was behind the other testing, theater, and cafeteria doors. Well, to my disappointment, unfortunately there's not much at all behind these doors. Each one just contains a small empty room, with the theater room curiously being the largest. But there is a room behind these doors though, which is more than I can say for some stuff we'll see later in this video, so perhaps there once was a plan to use these doors. Also, there's not much behind the innovation room with the big door, but we do at least get to see where the conveyor belt thing from the room ends up going. Next, when moving on from this room, you can see Huggy Wuggy's arm slither away as you walk down this corridor. I was curious to see how this was done, and I thought it was just going to be a model of the arm, but to my surprise, Huggy Wuggy actually is standing behind the door in a menacing T-pose. So menacing that he's like clipping through several walls. But yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that the developers just slapped him in here and just animated his arm for the effect. Next oddity I found was in this room where after you drop the second grab pack hand, for some reason a duplicate of it can be seen found under the floor. Even after you grab the second hand, this duplicate still remains there. It's pretty strange. Also around here under the floor is this weird glass thing being supported by a stand or something. Not really sure where this was meant to go. Then next up, not really anything normally unused per se, but I don't know about you guys, but I had no idea where this hallway was heading just before the big Huggy Wuggy jump scare here. Well, this is actually the same hallway from the main hub area where we saw Huggy's slithering hand earlier. It just has these added shadow filters now. Not sure why we'd want to go back there. I think maybe the developers just thought players wouldn't recognize this hallway from before, but yeah, if you pay really close attention, it doesn't really make as much sense, I guess. Ah, the super tense vent chase scene. Well, here if we move the camera out of bounds, we can see that there are like 3 instances of Huggy Wuggy loaded in at the same time, just waiting to be called to action. So as this shows, it isn't really the same Huggy model that chases you around, but a different one is loaded in depending on what segment of the chase sequence you are in. It's pretty cool. Then, just after the vent section, you get to yeet this box onto Huggy and send him flopping on down as he spits out some strawberry jelly along the way. Yep, that's definitely what this is. And if you've ever wondered where Huggy Wuggy ends up, well, he actually just remains here chilling in the void and striking a pose forever. Does this confirm that Huggy survives the fall? Not really, but he isn't just a bloody pile of fur as you'd expect him to be from such a tumble. Then lastly, towards the grand finale of the chapter, if you're like me, perhaps you were curious about this one door here that seems to be blocked off by this shelf thing. On my first playthrough, I was convinced it had to be of some sort of relevance. Well, turns out my intuition was quite off, as later, after moving the camera behind the door, we can see nothing. There's not even a small room here like we saw earlier with the rooms in the hub area. Well, maybe my intuition wasn't completely off, as this door is focused on in the trailer for Chapter 2, so I guess it will have some significance then, but for now, it's a whole lot of nothing. On the brighter side though, we can see the back room void here, and we can also see a whole bunch of lamps that are just displaced outside of the walls. Not sure why these are here, but I imagine it would have something to do with how the lighting effects are handled in this hallway. And now, let's switch gears and talk about some unused rooms that are found left over in the game's files. First up is a map simply titled Entry, and just like most of these areas, it loads us into basically complete darkness. It's so dark that at first I didn't think there was anything here at all, and it wasn't until I barely saw what looks like a checkered pattern on the floor here, and I want to assume this is some sort of default flooring for the Unreal Engine or something. This map is only 12 kilobytes large, so I guess that's basically all for Entry here. Next up, we got Achebe's Poppy level. Hope I said that right, and here we're greeted to a short little cutscene of the player opening a door and closing it right away. Then we find ourselves in this untextured office with some very basic geometry going on. Then, after noticing this bookshelf is slightly protruding, you can actually open it to reveal a long spiraling staircase leading down to a lower floor. Then, at the bottom of the staircase is another door, and this one leads us to what looks to be an early version of the Poppy room at the end of the chapter. Although the fine details are obviously lacking, the layout is sort of similar to the final, down to this divider thing in this room. Then at the end, instead of being in a glass box as seen in the final, here Poppy is in an opaque box and only a silhouette of her can be seen from the front. Now, if I'm being honest, I think this is a bit creepier than the glass case. Based on all that's seen here, as well as the name of the file, I think it's pretty safe to assume this was an earlier version of the Poppy room, and also this might have been the original end of the chase segment with Huggy, as the player would try to slam the door on him. Additionally, if you wait around too long in the starting office room here, the sequence will actually restart, suggesting that the player was planned to have a limited time in the office room to find the secret bookcase entrance before Huggy would break on through or something. Then, as the name of this map implies, this was developed by Achebe Spencer, who is credited in the game as a character artist as well as taking care of lighting. And with all the funky lighting going on as you get closer to Poppy, I think this was a good testing area for that as well. Similarly, in a folder titled Achebe's Lighting Scenarios is a map titled C1 Lighting Dusk Dark. And at first I thought this was just another early test area, but it turns out that this is basically the final layout of the map, with just much of it missing, with mostly just various light fixtures found all over the place. Based on the naming here, again, I assume this was for testing lighting in the different areas. Then next is yet another lighting-based map, and this one is called Temp Lighting. I couldn't find much here except for a single door found way far in the distance. Yeah, nothing else really here but this. And back to the unused rooms with actual stuff to talk about, next is Huggy Reveal Temp Map, and I think the name of this room speaks for itself. Here you spawn into a dark corridor with a lone door at the end. I wonder what happens if I try to open. Yeah, opening this door makes Huggy Wuggy start chasing you in a dominating T-pose. Honestly, can't decide if this is more or less creepy than the chase scene in the final game. Well, I guess one good thing about this area is that nothing really happens when Huggy touches you. He kinda just pauses for a few seconds before starting to chase you again. It was really amusing seeing Huggy in a goofy state like this, and the music only made it that much better. And last up for this video is an unused room titled Models Unused. That sounds pretty promising, right? Well, it actually is, and this map has quite a few cool things to see. First up is the most prominent section of this map, a large office-like area. This office area has various small rooms as well as several hallways with many locked gate things around. Almost all of the office rooms are empty save for like two which have a desk. Not sure what made these 2 rooms special compared to the rest, but yeah, they got a desk and a computer and all that stuff. And additionally, there's one more office room, only this one is much larger and at the end of the hallways, I guess belonging to someone in the office higher up the chain. Perhaps this was an early idea for a chase sequence where the player would have to hide around in the offices and avoid Huggy Wuggy or something. I assume this could be the offices of Playtime Co., and the bigger office room could have been for someone at a higher position like Lathe Pierre. Either way, it's a really creepy atmosphere. If you've ever had to go to an office late at night, once everyone's gone home, you might know this eeriness. It also really reminds me of the whole backrooms creepypasta stuff. Anyways, this certainly isn't all there is to see in this unused map either. Next we got another long hallway, also very creepy. Then, just as creepy, a bathroom. And oh, no, this isn't just any ordinary bathroom. This one has color-coded stalls. And if you've played through Chapter 1 of this game, you may recognize that from left to right, this is the same color order seen on the train at the start, which happens to be the password for the door to the security room. So perhaps this was once planned to be the original way to find out the color combination? Honestly, a trip to the Playtime Co. bathroom would have been pretty cool, I suppose. There's not much else to this bathroom here, so now on to the final area of this map. First is this hallway with some sort of big locked door. By now you've realized doors and walls are no match for me, so going through this lock thing reveals probably the most disturbing room yet. Here we can see an assembly line of doll parts, I assume for producing Poppy dolls. All of these heads are seriously creepy. I know we kinda see something like this in the intro cinematic when starting a new game, but this would have been a really disturbing area to actually see during the chapter. Maybe this is something we'll see in future chapters or trailers or something, but for now, I guess it'll just keep doing its job of fueling my nightmares for a bit. Alright, first, a bit of backstory for this prototype dev build of this chapter. So at first, I didn't even know that this was an earlier build. As soon as I saw that Steam was pushing out updates for this chapter, I quickly copied the game's data to a separate drive to preserve the original. Then when going to the game's files, naturally I clicked on DLC Chapter 2, thinking that was where I needed to go to play the second chapter. Makes sense, right? Well, soon after booting up, I noticed quite a few weird things like this checkpoint selection option, as well as a whole bunch of debug text on the screen when loading into the game. Now, at first, I thought I messed something up and unlocked some debug features, but later I learned that this was actually a fully functional prototype of the game that was packaged in with the release of this chapter. And as of the making of this video, the current version of the game on Steam still has this in the files. So if you'd like to dinkle around with it yourself, all you need to do is click into your Steam folder, go into DLC Chapter 2, Windows No Editor, and then launch the executable there. Easy as that. Not sure if this was intended by the developers, I assume not, so I think this will be eventually removed in the future updates, so access it while you can. Anyways, back to the actual prototype. Like I mentioned, right away on the title screen we can see the first major feature of this build. Essentially, you can input a number anywhere from 0 through 35 here, and then set it as your current checkpoint in the game. For example, 0 is the start of the game, 5 is the green hand production room, 35 is the end of the game, etc. This is honestly super nifty if you want to replay a section of the chapter, especially towards the end of it, without having to replay it over and over again. And the other thing I mentioned was the debug text that appears on screen. Now this shows off a bunch of information like which hand is shot out, what stuff is loaded in, how you die, and a whole bunch of other stuff. It got quite annoying to always have this taking up space on screen, and frankly, a lot of the messages weren't that valuable to me, so I ended up just disabling this. And oh yeah, I didn't mention it yet, but with this dev build, you also have immediate access to the game's console commands, something that often you need third-party software to unlock, so you can fiddle around with that here as well. And probably my favorite feature that this dev build offers is an unrestricted free camera. So you can take the camera wherever you want in this chapter to see stuff hidden out of view. This feature, along with disabling the lighting, was absolutely a blessing for making this video possible. Now those debug features are fun and all, but there are so many changes seen in this chapter compared to the final release we got. Now I'm sure I won't catch every change, especially more minor ones like props being placed in different places, but I wanted to go front to back in this chapter and show off all the changes that I was able to note. So of course, spoilers ahead. Alright, so when starting off this chapter, the first thing I immediately noticed is that some subtitles appear when Poppy whispers to you. Now this is extra interesting since as of the making of this video, this chapter doesn't offer any sort of subtitles. And although the subtitles in this build are only seen like twice in the first two messages here, I guess the developers were at least working on it, so maybe we'll see subtitles implemented in a future update. The next change we see right away, and the one that first made me clue in that this build of the game is different than the final, is here with this door. The door to Elliot's office in this build is just a regular old white one, which I guess was just a placeholder before the fancier wooden one was implemented. The Huggy Wuggy cardboard cutout wasn't put in yet, the gold flower statue was originally found in the closet with the Poppy key instead of on the desk in Elliot's room, which, speaking of which, just isn't there in this build, even though there's stuff floating over top of where it should be. Then another notable change in this room is that the vent up here where Poppy peeks out of wasn't added in this build yet either. Then onto the power puzzle room where you first find Poppy. In this build, she isn't hiding out in a box before you meet her, instead she just kinda phases into existence. Then once back outside of the office here, another weird thing is seen with these hand scanners. Although the right hand is seen here in red, the loading bar appears green, which is kind of odd. Then after swinging into the next room, a small change I noticed in the dev build is that this vent here is open instead of closed as seen in the final. Now this is just a theory of mine, but I'd be willing to bet that Poppy was at least once planned to appear in this vent as she would move along with you into the room with the big hole. There's also two things here that I think support this. Firstly, in the final, the vent is open on the other side of the room here, and then this one is closed. So either she closed this vent behind her, or used the door to get into the next room and also closed it behind her, both of which I think are unlikely. And then secondly, every other block in this room can be moved around except for this big red one by this vent, suggesting that this was an important set piece to this room. So my theory is that Poppy would have come out of this vent and then would climb up, or would have had the player helping her up to this vent up here to get her into the next room. I think this would have been definitely more interesting than just running into her already in the room that follows. And speaking of this room, the prototype version doesn't have the signs on each hallway indicating where they would lead to in the facility. Then, after taking a slide down and doing the power puzzle here, the next major change I want to bring up is with many of the bits of dialogue in this build. For the most part, the voice lines are identical, it's just that this prototype uses raw voice lines without any effects. For example, here's a quick comparison of some of Mommy's lines between the builds.
Oh, isn't it amazing? Mommy hasn't seen the place up and running in years. Oh, isn't it amazing? Mommy hasn't seen the place up and running in years.
Now next, onwards we go to the main game station hub area. Now here outside of the area just looking a lot more empty, the biggest difference is actually with the train itself. As you can see, it's quite unfinished. The front is basically completely untextured, and even the rear units lack a few textures as well. Although you can still open the door with the green hand, there's no ramp or stairs to get in. There's actually a bit more to this train, but we'll save that for when we get to the ending of the chapter. The weirdest thing I find with this train is that there's actually a separate one that gets loaded above this room when you're walking around in other areas of the chapter. And this one, albeit still lacking some textures, is much more textured than the one that's seen normally here. It's really strange. Oh yeah, also in this room is a very large part of the code you need to get the train rolling. This first part is given to you after completing the musical memory game, so it's kind of odd that it's here as well. And on that note, let's now move on to the first sub-area here. Although a few of the cardboard cutouts are still seen in this chapter, the one here for Bunzo Bunny is here, but it lacks the button to hear the audio bits. I think this is the only instance that I saw of a cutout that's seen where it is in the final version, but it's a different model. Anyways, now we get to the green hand molding room, and things are pretty much the same here, but in this early version, you have to press this button here to get the green paint conveyor belt to start. This button is still there in the final release, but the green paint will automatically just go to you when you get up there. Now onto the memory match game. For starters, Bunzo Bunny appears to lack all animations when moving downward, and the lighting is almost non-existent. So much so that at first, just seeing the silhouette, I thought that this was some weird, freaky alien thing with a tiny head. Then, possibly the biggest difference in this room is the final button of this minigame. In the final version, this button is an exclamation mark in a triangle, but in this prototype build, it's a button that just has the word reset on it instead. Additionally, this button doesn't float in the middle and behind all of the other buttons, and instead just floats right through all the others on the bottom, making it look quite goofy. Next, we got the rejected toys room, and here, in addition to the TV and VCR combo being moved from the top area to the bottom here in the prototype, the golden statue that's found on a bunch of stacked boxes is instead just found on top of these movable stairs. I can only assume this change was made to limit confusion, since most players would probably think you could climb up these stairs to grab it. Next, moving on to the Wacka-Wuggy section of the chapter, there's not too much to comment for this minigame itself, and the real only difference in bounds that I could find is once again with the VHS and TV combo. In the final, they are right beside each other and basically impossible to miss, almost forcing you to watch Jack Spadicy here. In this prototype though, the TV is found in this side of the room here, and the VHS tape is found in the next room, pretty much forcing you to redo the last section to put it in the VCR. And with that, now we're on to the final subsection here for the statues minigame, where some more interesting changes can be seen. Being the final minigame, it shouldn't be too surprising that this section isn't nearly as polished as the others. For starters, PJ Pugapillar appears quite different in this prototype, as he's covered in blood, much like many of the toys of him found around the facility. I guess the player wasn't meant to be the first victim in this area. Also at the start, PJ kinda just hangs there, as opposed to standing on a big boulder thing like he does in the final. Then moving along, only a sign for the leftmost easy pipe is placed in here, but it doesn't really matter which tunnel you take, as at the end of all of them, due to this object being misplaced, you get stuck no matter what. The end of this room is also much less intricate, as it just leads to a large empty corridor instead of the confusing pile of rubble that I initially thought you were supposed to climb on my first playthrough. Then next we move along to the water treatment facility, where immediately we can see that there's some early placeholder text on these signs. Instead of the more stylized rotate top or bottom 90 degrees signs, these just simply say top 90 or bottom 90. The green VHS here, which lacks any labels in the prototype, seems to have been swapped with the note here instead, and it was moved to being in front of the game station door, which, oh yeah, is completely missing here as well. Then the middle section of this puzzle also appears much less finished, lacking the middle column and blue thing holding the platforms together, and the handrails to all 4 sections are missing as well. Then in the toy puzzle room here, things are also in a much less than finished state. Right away, you'll notice that instead of Bunzo Bunny toys being moved around on the conveyor belts, we got basic models of a gift box. Furthermore, this area also lacks any sort of arrows indicating which way these levers move the elevator, as well as which way the conveyor belts are moving. It doesn't really make the puzzle that much more difficult or anything, it's just much less confusing with the arrows. Oh yeah, and there's also no traces of Huggy Wuggy being here, like the bits of fur or his blood that have led fans to theorize that this is where Huggy Wuggy falls after Chapter 1. Anyways, once after getting to the top and completing the puzzle here, you also don't just grab the box off the conveyor belt like you do with the doll in the final. Instead, you have to switch the conveyor so that the box will move onto the elevator, then you have to interact with the box to reveal that it was containing a Bunzo toy all along. Then after taking the toy and putting it into the scanner, which is almost impossible to see here, we can move on to this next puzzle room, where the only real difference I could find was yet again with the VHS tape as it's found on this table here, instead of being in the box with the green hand power source. After completing this, we then get to the start of the end with the jump scare for Mommy here, where this door appears to be a placeholder version, as we can see it awkwardly open with some default textures inside. Then Mommy doesn't really chase you here. As long as you're out of sight by the time she counts down to 0, you can actually go back up and she'll just be gone. The next major difference can be seen in this room here. In the final release, you pull this red switch to activate the conveyor belt to move into this emergency exit room. In this prototype build though, this switch is actually walled off with a one-way chunk of sheet metal, and instead there's an exit sign suggesting that this was the original intended path here. And this path here is actually the same one that you go on towards the end of this chapter, so I guess in this build you basically would go through it twice, so I guess it's a good thing that this was changed. Other changes down here include this sealed door swinging open instead of moving upwards. There's a random model of Mommy sticking out in the wall here that looks way too happy when we look out of bounds. And then we get to the furnace room, which was certainly unfinished in this build. Here, the puzzle is rather similar, but the assets are all different. Instead of bringing up a yellow gear mold to this furnace mold to then get another gear to insert into this motor, here you would grab this unfinished gear mold, slap it into the furnace, which here has another version of it floating beside it, to then get this gear to fit into this open gear train. Furthermore, there are some bits of floating text outside of this room that reference a second key and another mold. There's actually this mold found far off out of bounds in the distance that appears to be a mold of a triangular key similar to the one that's seen in episode 1, so perhaps there was also a second step to this puzzle that was planned here as well. Anyways, yeah, this puzzle appears visually a lot more basic in this build, like hell, this gear train doesn't even move at all, but the idea is still pretty much the same. Then, after opening this door and running back to avoid Mommy, you will notice that the inside of this furnace doesn't have handles to pull it closed. So instead of having to close the door to hide like in the final, here you can just go inside, and I guess Mommy just doesn't see you. In fact, instead of closing the doors, you can only push them open even more here to hide even less. Makes sense. The rest of the chase sequence with Mommy is basically the same, only with the hands and stuff not quite in the right spots, and honestly, Mommy just seemed to move a lot faster here, making this section quite difficult. And now onto the climax here. After opening this last door to escape Mommy, we're greeted to quite the early version of her death animation.
What have you done? You make me part of him! You can't do this to me!
Yeah, unfortunately she doesn't get ground up, but instead is just like pulled into the machine, and then her model just remains all stretched out on the floor. Also, there is absolutely zero presence of the creepy prototype claw thing here. There is a long hallway behind this door, but yeah, just no prototype fella. A few other changes from this point include the doors around the control room here just like floating when open. The number sequence for the last bit of the train code always appears to be 1423 instead of being sort of randomized like it is in the final. There are some spots where you can actually fall back down to the middle, which would be an absolute disaster to have to backtrack after. And finally, the way back down to the hub area is just some boring old stairs here instead of the slide that's used in the final version. Now back to the train. We can see the untextured inside, as well that there are 2 brake levers, 2 handles to start the train, and the whole console appears much different than the one seen in the final. The functions are the same, but yeah, it just looks so different. Now honestly, at first I didn't think this train would be functional at all. But not only does the code work, you actually don't even need it to start the train, as just pulling the handle here will get the train rolling, regardless of what code is entered. So I guess that wasn't really programmed in here yet. Although the train whistle handle unfortunately doesn't work here yet either, to finish things off, the ending here is actually quite different. Poppy's dialogue is almost entirely different in this prototype build compared to the final. Here's a comparison of what Poppy says in both of the ending clips.
I was so scared she'd put me back in that case. But you saved me. You are perfect. Too perfect to lose. I'm sorry. I can't let you leave. I've never met anyone like you. Do you know how long I've been stuck in that case? Well, too long. I had so much time to think and reflect. Time to figure out exactly what I would do when free. We'll set things right. Terrible things have happened, but I know that whatever I need you to do, you're capable. We will. What if... You did it. Against all odds. You defeated Mommy. And you freed me once again. You are perfect. Too perfect to lose. I'm sorry. I cannot let you leave yet. You have so much potential. I know you came to find the ones who had disappeared all those years ago. But they're gone. They've been gone for a long time. Terrible things have happened, and I am the cause. Being able to exist as a doll, it has killed so many people. So much is unknown to you. Where do I even begin? But you can fix everything. I see it inside you. This train is now heading towards Playcare. It's the best place to start looking. What is...
So although she still bamboozles you, in this prototype build, she seems much less antagonistic than in the final, where I guess her betrayal was really made to seem more negative. And honestly, yeah, I feel like it gives a completely different feel to the ending. After this, the train will also start to go fast, but in the prototype, you actually don't have to hit the brakes, as you'll just keep going forever and ever, and after a while, the background audio will just cut out too. But if you do pull the brakes as intended, you're greeted to a very much unfinished animation of the train crashing, and then you just die and get sent back to the last checkpoint, being at this emergency exit door before Mommy's grind. So yeah, I guess there's no ending cutscene teaser for the next chapter that was implemented in this build yet either. Alright, so it's no secret that the individual chapters for Poppy Playtime aren't very long, and although the second chapter is certainly longer than the first, it's still only about a 2-ish hour experience. But what if there was something being planned that could increase replayability for this game? Well, as it's been starting to circulate around the internet lately, Chapter 2 actually contains various leftover bits and pieces of a scrapped multiplayer mode. Now I know some bits of this have been shown off on YouTube, but there's more to it that's only been recently discovered that I don't think I've really seen anyone talk about here. And some of these unused bits have even been re-implemented, at least partially, into the game by data miner and modder Mala. So, for starters, it appears that this unused multiplayer mode was basically going to work sort of like the game Dead by Daylight. Now, if you haven't played Dead by Daylight before, basically one player plays as the monster or villain and has to hunt down and incapacitate 4 other players who have to complete a set of tasks to escape an area. In this case with Poppy Playtime Chapter 2, found in the files is an asset listed as a Monster Selector, and it appears that here, one player was to use this as a selection screen to choose to play as either Huggy Wuggy here or Mommy Longlegs. And then the rest of the players would be one of 5 differently colored Playtime co-models as they're seen in the training videos throughout the game. Orange, green, the default yellow one, blue, as well as red. And then for the gameplay, each different class of player would also have a different moveset. Huggy Wuggy would have a charge hug move, an ability to break traps that I assume the other players could put down, as well as a basic punch attack for which actually the animations are also left over unused in the game. This basic punch is also programmed to deal 25 damage points out of the 100 required to apparently down a player. Then Mommy Longlegs would be able to use a spotter ability, shoot out a spider web which currently uses a ball as a placeholder for the projectile, as well as another basic attack move just like Huggy which would also deal 25 damage points. And then lastly for the rest of the players, the moveset is much less interesting as you can just sprint, crouch, as well as use the grab pack hands. Basically just the moves you'd have playing the game normally. But the player characters also get access to some emotes that otherwise go currently unused in the game. These emotes are seen as hand gestures and were meant to be accessed by pressing certain keys on the keyboard. Pressing 1 would be a thumbs up, 2 would be a thumbs down, 3 would be an OK hand gesture, and finally, the best one, pressing the F and U keys, the player can flip the bird. Hell yeah. And just like with Huggy's slap move animations, there are also a few animations left over for these training dummy characters too. Stuff like idling and crawling around when being downed by an enemy, walking while crouched, running, walking while upright, falling, as well as these strange animations for looking up and looking down. Then, in addition to all of these models, found left over in the game's unused multiplayer folder is also this blue hand scanner, just listed as MP hand panel, go figure, as well as this cube frame thing listed simply as Win Cube. Now, this cube is found in a subfolder titled Testing, so I assume the point of this Win Cube was to quickly win a round of the multiplayer mode to test some functionality. Then next, there are also some leftover screens meant for this multiplayer mode too. First, there's a screen that would appear when Huggy Wuggy would down a player, and it mentions that another player could revive them. Then next, there's this screen for when Mommy Yonglegs, or Mommy Longlegs, I guess someone forgot to capitalize, would win the game, presumably once all players are taken down by the enemy monsters. And conversely, lastly, there's also a screen for when the players would have won the round by escaping, for which it appears they would be granted 150 points. What these points were going to be meant for isn't entirely clear. I was thinking maybe for some sort of XP system, but there's also references in the game to some cosmetic items, so perhaps these points could be, or one day will be, usable to obtain different cosmetics or emotes. Let's just hope the developers learned from the NFT debacle and they don't add microtransactions to the game. Anyways, although as of the making of this video, the multiplayer mode hasn't been modded back in to work in the game, and it's only found in a very fragmented state, we can see that there's still quite a lot of work put into this mode, so I don't think this is a scrapped mode, but rather something that's still being worked on and may get implemented in a future update, maybe Chapter 3. I guess basically only time will tell, but I really do hope it does come out because this would seriously add some replayability to this game so it's not just a 2-hour or less experience. And that's about all that's been found and re-implemented for the currently unused multiplayer mode, at least for now. Just based on how much work it seems was put into this mode, I'd be really surprised if we don't see this added in a future update. So to kick things off for this video, let's fire on through a few changes that were made to Chapter 2 here compared to what was shown in the teaser trailers leading up to its release. Now first, one of the biggest changes that I noticed when going back to the trailer is that originally, in the musical memory minigame section of the chapter, instead of Bunzo Bunny being lowered down as time ticks away, the trailer shows that Daisy here was going to be the main enemy instead. Honestly, I do think that Bunzo with his symbols was the better choice, but hey, seeing this flower drop down would have been pretty unsettling too. Other changes can be seen in the game station hub area with the train, as it seemingly looks unfinished in the trailer, as it lacks many of the details seen in the final, like missing the signs for all the sub areas, as well as the whole platform where you take the steps up to reach the console with all the levers, which is also missing in this trailer. Oh, and in the trailer, the train doesn't have the green hand scanner here yet either. For the Whack-A-Huggy minigame, it looks like originally the mini Huggies might have also been able to appear from tunnels in the ceiling. The way you obtain the green hand for the grab pack looks different, and then probably the biggest character change can be seen here with PJ Pugapillar, where originally he was all pillar and no pug. I do think this original strictly Caterpillar design is creepier, but the PJ design we got overall is much more memorable. Although it doesn't seem like the changes seen here are as drastic as what we saw with FNAF Security Breach, at least in terms of gameplay, I think it's still really cool to see just how much was changed during the few months between this trailer and the actual release of the chapter. And now for the second part of this video, let's zip the camera out of bounds in Chapter 2 here and check out some things found normally hidden out of view. Now, I'll be mostly looking through the prototype build version of this chapter since, although there it makes the game not look as pretty, I was able to do this, which makes it way easier to see things out of bounds where normally, without proper lighting, it's almost impossible to see any details. So with that said, let's pop out of bounds and check some stuff out. Now, of course, there's stuff like being able to go past the blockage at the start of the chapter to try and go back to chapter 1 to see that there's just nothing there anymore, or that there's nothing actually behind most of the doors in the facility here, but I want to focus mostly in this video on actual objects and such found out of bounds. So on that note, first up, in the room we first get to see Poppy in this chapter, she's found just chilling outside of the walls here. Now, in my previous video covering the prototype build, I mentioned how the cardboard cutout of Huggy that's seen in the final version in this room wasn't added in yet in the prototype version. But it turns out that actually this cutout is found in the prototype, only it's way off on the other side of the map, close to the ending section of this chapter. No idea why this ended up being all the way over here, but yeah, it sure is there alright. In my video on the prototype build, I also mentioned how the door to Elliot Ludwig's office was different in the prototype. Well, once again, it turns out that the fancier door that's seen in the final version is found hiding just below the floor here. I guess the developers were intending on putting it in at this point, but might not have implemented all of its functionality yet. Also, while we're still in the starting area for this chapter, found off in the distance is this small and empty, untextured room. At first I thought this was just a random empty box, but after making a quick comparison, this actually appears to be an early version of the intro power room where you meet Poppy. Why this unfinished and untextured room is still left in here is anyone's guess. Then next, after the cutscene where Mommy introduces herself to the player is done, outside of the boundaries here, not only can Poppy be seen constantly replaying her animations that are used while she's grabbed, but on the other opposite side of this hallway, there's also a model of Mommy constantly just replaying her animation of grabbing the player's right red hand. I think it's really strange that instead of deloading these assets, the developers just moved them off to the sides out of view instead. And this is actually something we'll see a lot of going forward. And surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, depending on how you look at it, this isn't like something they just did in the prototype build either, as these models like this are pretty much all found this way in the final build as well. Anyways, next, not far from this Mommy is another Mommy here in which she's grabbing a small Huggy Wuggy. Now this actually isn't an animation that's seen in the game, but rather this appears to be the animation that was used for the teaser trailer for this chapter. They certainly did make it look good for the trailer, but what we didn't see there is that instead of it just being a model of her arm and hand, her entire body model is used, and for the animation, they pretty much just moved her entire torso while in a T-pose to animate the arm. It looks incredibly bizarre, but you ain't seen nothing yet, we're just getting started. Now in the game station area, first we got this second train found above the room that I mentioned in my prototype video. Now after some review, this actually appears to be the train model that was used in the teaser for this chapter, as we can see that the window is the same, and it lacks the green hand scanner thing. But interestingly, the train below that is used in this prototype build only has 3 total train cars instead of 4. Then, while that train is above this hub room, below the floor we can also see an untextured, what appears to be unfinished version of one of the archway things for the stairs. And yeah, once again we can see the unfinished version just shoved off to the side of the final one. There will be more on this room and the train when we get to the end section of this chapter, but for now, let's move on to musical memory, where we get our first taste of some unseen text found just out of bounds. In this room, under the floors, some text can be seen, and this appears to mimic the words that are seen on the screens telling you the order of buttons to press for this minigame. So I'm guessing this was used as a placeholder for the screens until proper graphics were made. Furthermore, when you complete this minigame, you get to see an otherwise unused message simply saying, "Good job, you win." Then also in this area, found behind one of the walls, is another text graphic, and this one appears to be an indicator of which difficulty level you are currently on. This starts at 0 and then goes up as you progress through the game until round 5. For both of these text boxes, if you leave this area and then later revisit them, they will default to just saying, text. Yep, you sure are text. Now next up is this rejected toys storage room where just under the floors, some cutouts of various characters can be seen, as well as these blocks spelling out Huggy's name. We got 2 cutouts of Huggy, one of BoogieBot, one of Cat B, as well as one of Brawn the Dinosaur. I know I remember seeing the 2 of Huggy in Chapter 1, but I don't think I've seen them anywhere in Chapter 2. And extra interestingly, only the cutouts of Brawn and Cat B are double-sided, while the rest only have textures on one side, leaving the other side, and even the edges, untextured. Also in this room, not really hidden away, but I saw this box with a post-it note with a phone number to call a Paddy, and I haven't really seen anyone cover this yet. Now unfortunately, although I was hoping this would lead to some cool ARG or secret, calling this number just results in an automated fella telling you that it's out of service.
Dialed is not in service. If you feel you've received this message in error, please hang up and try your call again later. Message CO18656.
Regardless, it's really strange that the developers went out of their way to make a texture for this, and the number just doesn't lead to anything. But I guess thankfully it's not someone's actual phone number. Next up we have this track area after the Whack-A-Huggy section. I teased this a little bit in my previous videos, but found out of bounds here are not 1, but 2 unseen and unused models of Kissy Missy. Now at first I thought at least one of these were just the model that's used, stored out of view, but no, if we look closer with some proper lighting, we can see that these models both appear to actually use Huggy Wuggy's blue texture as a base under the pink fur, as opposed to the model that is used having a proper pink base. Furthermore, the model that is used, even with lighting, always appears like a silhouette, and it always starts out with this spiky teeth version that's never seen. As soon as you get close enough, the model instantly snaps to the smiley version that helps you out. I speculate that with this other door close by, this Kissy Missy under the floor here was probably used as a placeholder in an earlier build of this chapter. And this one here, found out of bounds by Barry here, to me suggests that maybe there would have been some other interaction planned with Kissy Missy later on in the segment that was scrapped. Although I do wish we got to see more of her in Chapter 2, I think it's quite obvious that she'll have a much bigger role in the upcoming chapters. One character that probably won't have a bigger role in the future is unfortunately Barry over here. If you ever wondered what happens to Barry after he sends it into the abyss, well, he ends up just floating in the void here, still fully animated. Don't worry, buddy, your sacrifice won't be in vain. Now moving on to the statue section, once again we can find some out-of-bounds text. For starters, just under the map near the start, there's some floating text just saying, "Waiting for player." At first I thought this would change once I progress in the area, but nope, it just stays the same. Then at the end of the statue's hallway, found off to the side out of bounds are not 1 but 2 instances of text thanking the player for playing. At first I thought this might have been some leftover from the credits or something, but thinking back to the other text message earlier, I think it's more likely that these were once used perhaps for beta testers that would play this section, and then this text would show up for them at the end. Then also in this area, found under the first chunk of foam panels is a large white ramp thing, as well as this untextured slide, which appears to be an early version of this slide above that's once again just moved off out of view. It would be really cool if there was a secret path down here that you could find if you sank down long enough in the foam, kind of like in A Hat in Time, but I'm pretty sure this is just another instance of moving an unfinished object off to the side. And in case you were wondering, yeah, this slide and all of this unseen text is also seen in the final release of Chapter 2. And now getting to the ending section of this chapter, normally here, if you're within Mommy's line of sight when she finishes counting down from 10, you'll get bamboozled. But if we go down and then take the camera back up, we can see not only her instantly transform from her counting down animation to her just running in place for a bit, but she then just disappears. Okay? Now also just outside this room is this unused red button. No idea why it's here, but I'm assuming it had something to do with these doors. Then next, as we move along, we can see Mommy's arm sticking out of the wall here in the prototype build. And if we move the camera into the wall, we can not only see her full model in a T-pose, but we can also see another hand grabbing her own foot. Now this other hand here is the one that's later seen destroying this corridor, but why the full model is here too is, yeah, I don't know. Next up is this furnace puzzle room, and here there are a few things found outside of the room that I briefly touched on in my video covering the prototype version. Outside, we can see a reference to a second key, as well as another mold, suggesting that there might have been more planned to this puzzle than what was ultimately implemented. Furthermore, another key mold can actually be found floating in the void further away from this room. It appears to be a mold for a key that looks like the triangular one you get in Chapter 1, so it's likely that this might have been the second key and mold that's referenced in the Out of Bounds text. Then also near this unused key mold are the starting and ending power source units used for the power puzzles, as well as there's this yellow floating text saying power reroute. So perhaps this was just used by the developers to test the power rerouting for the puzzles. And while we're talking about stuff found further off in the void, there's also this whole chunk here that looks to be some sort of walkway. I don't recall seeing this anywhere else in this chapter, and some parts of it are still untextured, but just based on the way it looks, I'd assume this was meant for the ending section area. Anyways, back to the furnace room. Interestingly, not only are these text references still found in the final release version, but the old placeholder gear system that's seen in the prototype build is, you guessed it, just moved off to the side out of bounds here. Furthermore, also outside of this room is another what seems to be early version of the generator thing. This one also has a different type of door beside it, so maybe this was some sort of in-between version between the prototype and the final release one. Alright, and now finally for the mommy chase section, here we got probably the most stuff found hiding out of bounds. For starters, there's this large red placeholder slab, which indicates it's supposed to represent 15 meters just floating above here. In this area you can't reach when running away from mommy, we can see that this texture of PJ here is completely messed up out of view. There's this red text out of bounds demanding to not delete something, but what that something isn't really clear. Oh, and did I mention there are like 8 models of mommy found hiding out of bounds too? There's everything from one here creepily dashing above the furnace room, one of her just running along, one of her hanging out all mangled, and yeah, there's also this. Yeah, during the chase section in the sewer area, you can see mommy's hands trying to get you, and I guess this is how they did it. Once again, instead of just using a hand and arm model, the entire mommy model is used, and that results in this being found just out of view. Now, I don't know about you, but I think this is definitely some nightmare material. Also in this area are several additional floating bits of text that appear to be a guide of sorts for how the segment was going to play out. We got messages including, mommy runs past, slightly faster than you, arm blocks path, arm spazzing, and more. Obviously, this being the ending section of this chapter, it shouldn't be surprising that it wasn't as cleaned up as some of the others, but the fact that pretty much all of this is still there in the final version of this chapter is almost kind of funny to me. Anyways, next is the grinder section. In my video covering the prototype build, I've already mentioned that no trace of the prototype hand thing is seen there, but in the final version here, we can get a much nicer look at it behind the door, as well as when it drags mommy's remains away. Such a creepy looking thing. And finally now, we're at the finale of the chapter where we once again return to the Game Station Hub area. Now another thing I mentioned in the prototype video is that initially you would have taken some stairs back down to the main area instead of the slide as seen in the final. Well, in the final version, yep, you probably guessed it, the originally implemented stairs seen in the prototype are actually still here, just moved off to the side, never to be seen by 99% of players. Then next up, just outside the train in the prototype version, strangely a copy of the player's grab pack can be seen floating here. Then, although the train looks to be running more or less normal when looking at it from a distance in the final release, in the prototype version, yeah, it looks like they didn't really get around to animating it fully yet, as the second and third carts just steer parallel to the first. And yeah, you get this. This truly is a marvel of engineering. Oh, and also the green hand scanner thing appears like it isn't attached to the train yet in the prototype, so it kinda just floats in place after the train leaves. And now, last up for this video, let's have a look at how the ending section is handled. Now interestingly, I thought the train actually moves through the large track area, and although it does move through the track at first, after a while the train actually stops, and then the entire track ends up moving instead. It's honestly really goofy to watch the train stay in place while everything else moves around it, and if we take the camera back to the hub area, you just get to see this massive model move on through. Then we can also see how the track appears to go on forever if you don't hit the brakes. Basically, after a certain point, the track will just keep rewinding on itself forever, like so. And then, once you actually do hit the brakes, the train will progress down the spiraling section here before the ending crash animation occurs. And in the final version, we also get to see the sign for the play care just appear outside of the train window. But apart from that, unfortunately, there's no other indication of whose footsteps are heard approaching the crash at the end of the chapter. Alright, so I know the second chapter is much more topical now, but let's first kick things off here with some more unused content from Chapter 1. If you are just interested in the Chapter 2 stuff, there should be some timestamps in the video timeline. Anyways, let's first talk about some unused graphics, models, and animations. For the unused animations, first we got Huggy Jump Scare Anim, which, obviously based on the name and how it appears, is an unused animation of Huggy Wuggy jump scaring the player. Now this animation does appear to be really similar to the one that is used, but I guess they're different enough to warrant a separate slot. Then the other unused animation is, again for Huggy Wuggy, simply just listed as Huggy Anim, and this one just has Huggy doing whatever he's doing here. I can only assume this was like a very early test for animating the fuzzy blue fella. Then for unused models, first we got this early untextured and hairless version of Huggy Wuggy. It also has seemingly finished animations for walking as well as running, something that the final version of Huggy is never seen doing. In any case though, it seems like this version of Huggy did have a decent amount of work put into him. Then next is this small building thing that's just listed as Temp Factory Building, which although the name suggests it would be a placeholder version for the factory, this model is honestly way too small for that. Then next is this model of a tree that goes unseen since you never actually get to see the outside of the Playtime Co. facility. Then next, although we weren't introduced to an in-game model of Kissy Missy until Chapter 2, Chapter 1 actually did contain models for her as well. They were only seen in segments though, and a full model of her wasn't yet put together in Chapter 1, but this is a mock-up of what the model would look like with all the parts in place. Then next, moving on to some unused graphics for Chapter 1, first are a few placeholder images that were left in the game. The first of these is a placeholder for the main menu background graphic. Here we can clearly see a much more basic looking placeholder logo for the game, and everything else just looks unfinished too. The factory has various parts that appear to be still untextured, the clouds look much different in the final version, and many of the smokestacks are lacking in this placeholder too. Then there's also another image of what looks to be a placeholder for the Chapter 1 selection screen. Not only does this version use a different text font, but the actual model of Huggy here appears to be different as well. Then, also related to this title screen is this placeholder image of Poppy, so I guess maybe she was also considered to be featured on the title screen. Then next we got not one, but two early versions of the key icon that's seen after picking up this key from Huggy. One is pretty similar to the one that is used in the final, and the other one is clearly a more basic placeholder. Next, there's this graphic with some text telling the player to gain access to the toy factory, maybe intended for some sort of objective screen. And then next we got, I think, one of the creepiest unused graphics we've come across on Lost Bits in a while. This graphic is known simply as Huggy Image, and it features a dark, incredibly unsettling rendition of Huggy, in which he appears to have some messed up eyes, and his grin is absolutely nightmare-inducing. It's currently unclear what this was intended for, an early design of Huggy, an alternate form we'll see in a later chapter, who knows, only time will tell, I suppose. Then last up for the Chapter 1 unused graphics, there are what look to be wall art textures for both Kissy Missy as well as Candy Cat. The candy cat design is seen on some boxes in this chapter, but this unique isolated graphic isn't seen otherwise. And yeah, although Kissy Missy here is also seen in different styles, this graphic isn't ever seen either. And now lastly for chapter 1, there are also a few unused audio things that I didn't cover in my previous video. The first of these are unused voice lines found in a folder titled Simon Game, suggesting that they were for a Simon Says minigame intended for chapter 1. There are a whole bunch of audio clips in this folder, all featuring a robotic text-to-speech voice similar sounding to the staff bots in Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach. These include the voice telling the player how to play, which colors to press, and more. Also, there is a message that indicates that this was originally planned as being the way to restore power to the facility. Anyways, let's give these a quick listen.
This message is being broadcasted using the factory's backup power system. To reactivate this facility's main power, you must play a game of Simon Says, because at Playtime Co., everything is fun. To play, memorize the color sequences on the screen, and enter the exact sequence on the buttons below. Begin. Red, green, blue, yellow, orange, violet. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3, Level 4, Level 5, wow, you are doing so well. Next is Level 99. Next is Level 599. Great job. Oh no. The color sequence you chose was incorrect. Try again. No. Choose the correct colors. Try again. No. Congratulations. You won this game of Simon Says. See you again soon.
Now, if you've played Chapter 2 of this game, you know that this Simon Says type idea was re-implemented with the musical memory minigame there. So either they just started working on that while Chapter 1 was being developed, or maybe it was once intended to be seen there instead. And to support the idea that it was originally planned for Chapter 1, there's actually various leftover assets, including a level difficulty, a start lever, as well as a leftover file for a Simon Says room key. It doesn't have a model or anything left over, but this certainly suggests that at least some work was done on implementing a room like this in Chapter 1. Furthermore, there's also some unused audio tracks that were going to be used with this planned Simon Says minigame too, including a catchy background track as well as one where it glitches out at the end. Here's a quick sample of those. Honestly, with all of these changes and seeing how important this Simon Says minigame seems to have been for Chapter 1, it seems like the chapter overall must have been reworked quite a bit. Then, as a small aside here, there are actually 2 more keys like the Simon Says one left over. One for the gift shop room that's seen to the right of the entrance as you walk in, and then one for a store. Now, no stores are ever seen in Chapter 1, but to add to this, there's also this basic unused model of a currency coin that's believed to have been meant for that store. Unfortunately, it's currently unknown what this store would have offered or what its purpose was intended to be. Anyways, back to the audio stuff. Next up, Chapter 1 also contains audio files for 3 tracks from different video games. The first of these is the track Self-Esteem Fund from Portal 1, then there's the song Your Precious Moon, also from Portal, and then the last track is the song Out of Control from Resident Evil Village. Now, I would love to play these tracks for you here, but I'm not sure if they'll get flagged for copyright infringement, so to be safe, unfortunately, you'll have to search them up if you want to give them a listen. Additionally, the Resident Evil track isn't entirely unused, as it can actually be heard in the Huggy Reveal test map that I covered in my first video. Surely an interesting choice to grab a track from Resident Evil, but it certainly fits. Well, kinda. And now, lastly for this chapter, there are also several unused voice clips for a few of the VHS tapes that you find around the facility. Now, these appear to be placeholder versions of the voiceovers that were used before the developers hired on some voice actors, as you can tell the acting just isn't the same. In the interest of time, I won't play through all 4 of these placeholder bits of VHS audio, but to illustrate the differences, here's an example comparison of one of the tapes. If you'd like to listen to all of them, head on over to the Cutting Room Floor page, which as always is linked down in the description.
Hi, my name is Leith Pierre, and I'm the head of innovation here at Playtime Co. Toy Factory. If you're seeing this, then you're trespassing. Yeah, we play this little tape on loop whenever we close the factory for the day. So, trespasser, just to make you aware, while we pride ourselves primarily on our high-quality toys and excellent childcare, we also pride ourselves on our security.
Hi, my name is Leith Pierre, and I'm the head of innovation here at the Playtime Co. Toy Factory. If you're seeing this, then you're trespassing. Yeah, we play this little tape on loop whenever we close the factory for the day. So, trespasser, just to make you aware, while we pride ourselves primarily on our high-quality toys and excellent childcare, we also pride ourselves on our security.
And now, let's finally switch gears and move on to the more recent Chapter 2. First and foremost, I wanted to bring up that it appears that this unused office-looking map that was found in Chapter 1 was reworked and pared down into the Berry Cart puzzle area where you first meet Kissy Missy. Although obviously there aren't any office rooms down here in Chapter 2, the whole system of closed-off gates looks really similar. As soon as I reached this area in Chapter 2 on my first playthrough, my mind immediately went to making this connection. Similarly, although it's still very basic looking in Chapter 1, you could also make the argument that this test area for Poppy's room might have also served as the basis for Elliot's office that's seen in Chapter 2. Now next, let's move on to Chapter 2's unused graphics and models. For the models, first there are leftover unused models of this car as well as this fella who I assume was going to be the driver. Let's call him Jimbo. Jimbo looks ready for action. Anyways, both of these models are from the 1980s vehicle pack from the Epic Games Marketplace, I guess reinforcing what time period this game takes place in case the VHS tapes weren't enough. And in addition to these models, there are also various unused sound effects related to cars, such as car windows opening and closing, car crash sounds, and more. It's unclear what exactly the intention or purpose of these cars was going to be in this game, but I've heard some speculation that maybe initially the protagonist would drive up to the facility and start outside in Chapter 1, and this would also explain why some stuff like the Playtime Co. sign was modeled outside. Anyways, no taxi cars or Jimbos are seen yet in this game, so this will remain a mystery, I guess, at least for now. Next, I went over this stuff in my video dedicated to the unused multiplayer mode, but for some quick overlap here, other models that don't go used are the various colors of the default grab pack guy, the Win Cube, as well as this blue hand scanner listed as MP hand panel. It appears to be the same as the blue hand scanners that are seen in the chapter, but despite that, it is actually a unique, separate model. Oh, and there's also this whole monster selection box with Huggy and Mommy meant for the multiplayer mode too. Then back to more unused graphics, next are a pair of images of the red and green power cube circuit things that are seen as part of that one puzzle in Chapter 1. Then also from Chapter 1 is this early placeholder key icon. Welcome back, I guess? Then next, there's also this static image of a fire. These last two graphics were very likely placeholders for the Poppy key as well as the fire seen in the furnace, respectively. Next, we also got some unused textures of a few of the Playtime Co. characters. First, there's this texture meant for a cutout of Mommy Longlegs. There's only one cardboard cutout featuring Mommy seen in the game, and it's this one on the cart with BoogieBot that's seen in the game station area. But with this texture, I guess there were once plans to have a standalone Mommy Longlegs cutout too. Then next is this texture of Bunzo Bunny, also meant for a cardboard cutout. In fact, this is the texture that was used for the cardboard cutout in the game's prototype build that we went over in my previous video. But ultimately, this was replaced with the one seen in the final with the red button, leaving the earlier version unused. And finally, there's also this unused texture showing off the original design of PJ Pugapillar back when he was all pillar and no pug. This does, however, still seem different than his appearance in the teaser trailer, so I guess this might have been some sort of intermediate step between the original and final design we got. I don't think the design is quite as good as the one we ended up getting, but I still like this one nonetheless. Then lastly for the graphics, there are also various test tile textures. We got a few squares, even more squares, as well as a whole bunch of other ones, including these indicating their size in, I assume, pixels, as well as a reference for 15 real-world meters, similar to the red panel we saw out of bounds in my last video. Now moving on, there are also some video files that go unused in Chapter 2. The first of these videos, despite being labeled as a new version, is what looks to be an early version of the tutorial video for the Grab Pack's Green Hand. It's actually quite different too, and shows a scrapped feature of the Green Hand, where there was once planned to be an actual timer that would be visible on it, and it would count down for the 10-second limit of holding power. Then, the warning to use caution with it is different too, as the death of the default yellow fella is much more gruesome. Honestly, I think this death animation is much better than the one that was used in the final version. Additionally, this demo version also uses the awesome song A Burning Memory by The Caretaker. And this is actually one of at least a few areas that this game uses songs from The Caretaker as a placeholder. Another instance was also seen in the background music for the prototype version's Statues minigame. Then, while we're discussing more copyrighted stuff, the other unused video is an early version of the Mommy Longlegs commercial, where here, Itsy Bitsy Spider by Little Richard is used as a placeholder background song. I'm assuming the developers didn't want to pay for a license to use any of these songs, so it's no surprise that they were ultimately all replaced. They're also really good songs too, especially the ones by The Caretaker. I'd love to give you guys a snippet here, but I'm sure I'd get a nice fat copyright claim. So yeah, if you want to give them a listen, be sure to search them up sometime. Now, if you haven't seen my recent video documenting Chapter 2's prototype build, there I mentioned how Poppy's ending dialogue was changed. Well, it appears that there was actually more lines from her that were also scrapped, namely her first interaction with the player in Chapter 2. Uploaded by PluffyFX is a scrapped animation they made for Poppy's introduction in Chapter 2, but it was ultimately scrapped.
Don't be frightened. I'm going to help you. You set me free. In return, I will help set you free. You cannot escape the way you came. Your only escape is to take the train. It's just up ahead. The train requires a special code. I'm the only one left who knows it. Though you must be cautious. Mommy lurks in the darkness below. Mommy doesn't like guests.
So it seems like here the player would be given some more exposition and the whole objective of Chapter 2 would be explained. I guess this much exposition might have been too much to reveal too soon, but also, this version of Poppy appears to be the more gentle-hearted version that we heard in the scrapped version of the ending. Now, according to PluffyFX, this animation was scrapped since the character was changed during development. And I guess this only goes to support that Poppy was changed to be a bit more mysterious, suspicious, and ultimately, as we see at the end of the chapter, conniving. Then, another animator that worked on the game, Zamination Z, also posted some of his work including animations for Mommy and Poppy. And in this video, he also showed off an unused idle animation for Daisy the Flower. If you haven't seen my previous video, in short, before being changed to Bunzo Bunny, originally, as seen in the Chapter 2 teaser trailer, the animatronic that was planned to be lowered in the musical memory game was Daisy instead. Although this idle animation itself isn't all too exciting, I think it's cool to see this unused remnant from the earlier version of musical memory. Another cool thing revealed in this tweet is that most of the shots of Mommy in the commercial for her toy seen in the game, despite it looking like it was stop-motion animation of a real toy, is actually computer generated. Since they weren't able to make toys with stretchable arms, all of the shots of Mommy being stretched were computer made. But for some of the shots where she's just static, these 3D printed dolls of her were actually used instead. Anyways, back to Poppy here, there are a few more voice lines that never get used in Chapter 2. The first of these is her pointing out a fancy door and saying she'll deal with it.
Ooh, this is a fancy door. Okay, I'll go deal with this. You just stay here.
I can only assume this was intended for Elliot's door here, as I can't really think of any other fancy doors in this chapter. Then listed sequentially right after this one is just Poppy announcing her return.
I'm back. Miss me?
Based on it being right after the last one, I assume this would have been used for Poppy popping out of one of the vents somewhere after taking care of the fancy door. Then last is not a fully unused clip, it's just that most of it ends up being unheard since it gets cut off. And this is the voice clip that's used when Poppy gets grabbed by Mommy in this room. Here's what Poppy was going to say had she not been grabbed away by Mommy Longlegs.
Listen, I'm going to need you to trust me, okay? Enter this next room, and I will meet you at the bottom.
Now, based on Poppy mentioning that you should enter the next room and that she'll meet you on the bottom, it seems like originally Poppy would talk to you in this room before the one with the big hole, and I guess the whole bit with Mommy grabbing her was added in after the fact. Furthermore, this once again supports my old theory from my previous video where Poppy was going to have a bigger role in this room and would use this vent here to, I guess, crawl down to the next area. So this change also explains why the developers ended up closing off this vent in the final version. Then next up, in another tweet made by someone that worked on Chapter 2, Mad and Mangled tweeted the original storyboard plan for how Mommy Longlegs was going to get bamboozled at the end of the chapter. It appears that instead of her body getting ground up, she was initially planned to, lose her head instead. I guess this might have been deemed a bit too gory for the game, but honestly, this would have been pretty crazy to see. And on this note, I should also bring up that I've seen some fake storyboard videos being circulated around the internet too, and I've had people leave comments believing that they are actually real. These are in fact not official and are just fan-made, so if you or anyone you know thinks these are real, there is confirmation that they are fan-made fakes. The only one that is real is this Mommy one that we just went over earlier. In any case, I really love how some of the people that worked on this game have been tweeting their work. It really gives us cool insight into the game's development. And now, last up for this video, although Chapter 1 of this game saw a decent amount of unused leftover levels in the files, unfortunately there's only one unused map that's notable in Chapter 2 here. This map is simply known as Shader Debugs, and if the file name didn't already make it clear, this map was used for debugging the shaders for this game. Not very impressive when unlit, but there we go, much better. Anyways, so here we have a small area with an untextured sphere, a T-shaped tunnel segment with some one-way textures that can only be seen from the inside, as well as this Unreal Engine asset here. There's also some developer text found here under the tunnel. The first one mentions that you could see some volumetric light shafts if you disabled the Sky Dome mesh, and then the second one tells us that by pressing Control, the L key, and then moving the mouse, you could also move the sun around, I guess to see how lighting would affect the different objects from different angles. Unfortunately though, I couldn't find a way to get either of these to actually work in this map. Anyways, this appears to be an area that was used to test lighting on different textures inside of a tunnel, likely for the end sequence with the Mommy chase, as well as lighting on this, which I could be wrong, but I believe was a test for ray tracing. Not the most interesting test map we've come across on this series, but it's honestly still really cool in my opinion. Hopefully, we get to see more stuff like this left over in the game in the next chapter. Alright, so for some context first, here we'll be taking a much deeper look at the unused map fittingly titled Models Unused. Now I did cover this map in my first ever Lost Bits video on Poppy Playtime, and if you haven't seen it yet, basically we went over the map and had a look at an unused office area that appears to have been, at least loosely, reworked into the berry cart section seen in Chapter 2, an unused bathroom with the same color combination seen on the train in the gift shop in Chapter 1 that's used to open the door to the security office, and finally the creepy toy factory area with a whole bunch of toy baby heads. Well, a few days ago, NotAd5 reached out to me on Twitter and brought to my attention that there's actually much more to this unused map than previously thought. Although by default, this map is incredibly dark in most areas, and we can't disable the lighting here like I was able to do in Chapter 2, by manually adding in various light sources, we can quite literally bring light to the darkness here in this map. And by doing so, we can actually reveal that there is much more to this map than previously thought. In general, this appears to be an early and quite unfinished version of the area we get to explore in Chapter 1, and although some parts of the layout see similarities, overall it's very different. So buckle up, let's get through this map and see all of the changes. So for starters, this early map actually has a whole outside area with a quite large parking lot. Now normally you are never able to step outside in the final version of Chapter 1, but as we saw in my first Lost Bits video, there is a model of the Playtime Company sign that's found hidden out of bounds. And this has led to many people speculating that originally the player would either start outside of the factory, or there might have been some sort of cutscene outside that would lead up to starting inside. And furthermore, in my Chapter 2 video, we also went over some unused models found there of a car, as well as what's believed to be a fella that was intended to drive it that we named Jimbo. And now with this whole parking lot outside here in this unused map, I think this only reinforces the theory that originally you would have started outside the factory and I guess would have gotten dropped off by a taxi or something. Or who knows, maybe Jimbo here was actually going to be the protagonist. Anyways, also outside in the parking lot, there's this like security checkpoint thing on the edge of the map, and also these two small buildings. These do seem kind of out of place, as I'm not really sure what these could really be. Maybe like a security building, ticket sales, well, with nothing really inside them, it's basically impossible to tell. And speaking of things out of place, with all of these lights on now, we can see that the washroom that we originally found on this map is actually found outside of the facility just out front. And it turns out that the secret color-coded stalls here would be found in the women's washroom, while the men's washroom kinda just, yeah, I guess that's all we get. There are actually more washrooms just inside the facility, which we'll come back to later in this video, but it seems like the developers might have just been trying to see how they could fit this seemingly updated version into the map. Then, lastly for the parking lot here, we also have this, I believe otherwise unused, model of P. And this of course is the P from the Playtime Co logo, and this just sits out front of the main entrance to the facility. Then, before we move in, I should also point out that the exterior of the facility here definitely was going for the look seen in the main menu for the game, with the whole wavy design out on the front. In the final version of Chapter 1, this isn't seen outside in the front, and I think this pattern is only seen like once in the entirety of the chapter. Anyways, now stepping into the main lobby here, we can see that actually this area seems basically the same as how it's seen in the final version of Chapter 1. Well, minus all of the objects, of course. We got a very much unfinished version of the security office on the left, as well as an empty gift shop on the right. Even the sheet metal on the ceiling has the same colors on both sides as seen in the final. Interestingly, just under the area where the player ultimately receives the grab pack, there seems to be a more finished version of the hole in the wall, as this one actually has the roller system that would bring the pack in. I guess the developers just didn't get around to putting it in place yet. And the similarities to the final version's layout don't end here either, as next we can move on to the main hub area where you first meet Huggy Wuggy in the final. Although none of the corridors are labeled here properly yet, it does seem like they all would have led to where the signs say they would in the final. And we can first see this by going through this door, which brings us to an early version of the power room that is seen in the final version. And it actually looks basically the same, just without a bunch of the objects that were later added in. Next up is the path that you do take in the final chapter that ultimately takes you to the toy production room. And here in this early version, yeah, we also have a direct hallway to an early and once again empty version of that toy production room. The only hint here that indicates that these are actually the same rooms are these three holes in the wall, where in the final we see a bunch of the toy parts come into the room. And although there's not really much else to this room yet in this early map, there are various vent segments found just chilling out in the void here. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to them yet, and none of them are connected, so I guess at this point in development, the developers were just starting to piece together the vents for the Huggy Chase section. Also, before entering this room, if we follow the path that we do in the final version, turning left here brings us to a very much unfinished version of the mechanical hallway. Even the long blue Huggy arm on the floor is the same that's seen in the final. In this early map, this hallway here appears to lead back outside to the parking lot. Now, I don't think this would have just led to the same section where you start the chapter, but rather to an area that would be fenced off from the beginning, and I guess this would lead to another vent section that goes downward. And although this vent doesn't lead anywhere yet, you know what's found just under this area? The whole toy production room with the baby heads, so maybe that was meant to be the next stop for another power puzzle. Then after this, it appears that ultimately the player was to end up on the roof, as up here there is a vent entrance that seems to lead back to the toy production room in basically the same way that you enter it in the final version. And also connected to the production room here, behind this wall is a hallway that leads to this industrial looking room here, which unfortunately, it's unclear what its intended purpose was. Then back to the main hub room here. Although the rest of the rooms ended up being small empty ones in the final version, this prototype offers quite a bit more, at least for most of these. So next up is this room that eventually was labeled as testing. Unfortunately though, this door just leads to a small empty area which then just directly connects back to the toy production room. So I guess maybe based on the name of this room, this was where some toys would be taken to be tested for quality assurance. Then the room straight forward in the back of the hub area that's labeled as Innovation in the final is also just empty here unfortunately, but now this is where things start to get good. Next is the room labeled as the theater, and yeah, although it's empty in the final release, here, there's actually a small theater room complete with seating as well as a projector. There's also this texture on the walls that seems to be some sort of sound isolating material that I don't think is used anywhere else in the game. Then next up is the cafeteria room, which here is still labeled on the floor with some developer text. There are some tables, as well as this section where I guess employees or visitors would be able to grab some food. Now both of these rooms being rather small, I guess their intention must not have been crucial to the chapter, outside of maybe containing some collectibles or something. But hey, I think even if these rooms were added to the game with no purpose, they would have gone a long way in making the facility feel more authentic. And now, last but absolutely not least, what seems to be the biggest cut wing of the Playtime Co. factory for Chapter 1, we got the office area that seemingly would have required both the red and blue hands to access. Now we briefly went over the office in my first Lost Bits video on Poppy Playtime, but there are actually some more rooms here that we didn't see last time. First up, there are some rooms connected to these offices, including 2 washrooms as well as an F locker room, which I assume means it was the female locker room. There's not all too much here except some placeholder lockers, I guess, which are just large untextured blocks. Then directly connected to this locker room is the woman's washroom, which unlike the one found just outside, just has green colored stalls here, and much like the other locker room, here we have some more blocks acting as a placeholder for the sinks. And then lastly for this section, there's also the men's bathroom, which looks basically the same as the women's one, but I guess the men didn't get a locker room here. Come on, Playtime Co. First no bathroom outside, and now no locker room? Truly a tragedy. And lastly for this office area, we went over the small office room here in my first video, but it turns out that this isn't the end of this hallway, but rather it's more of a secretary room, as just behind this door is the main office room. This looks very similar to the office room seen in Chapter 2, which belonged to Elliot Ludwig, the founder of Playtime Company. So it's no surprise this would be the fanciest office. And with the wood trim and very similar looking wallpaper, I think it's extremely likely that this office was reworked into what we saw in Chapter 2. And furthermore, this office also seems to be a further along version of the really basic one we saw in my first video that was used in the early version of Poppy's room, where the player would slam the door behind them and then open the bookcase to escape whatever was chasing them to get to Poppy. The shape of the room, placement of the desk, chair, and bookshelves, it all seems to be basically the same. Interestingly, this unused Poppy map was actually removed from the game as of the current update, but the unused model map is still left over. It's kinda weird. Anyways, it appears that at this point in development, one change was made to how the player would, I guess, descend to Poppy's room below. Instead of opening the secret path behind the bookshelf and then taking a flight of stairs down, here the player would open up a secret hatch to go down instead. There's unfortunately nothing below here, so it seems that this is where development of this idea was stopped, but still, it seems like it could have been a really cool concept. So to kind of recap, it seems like the original plan was for the player to go to these offices sometime after getting the second red grab pack hand. And then in some final chase scene, presumably again running away from Huggy Wuggy, the player would have had to make their way into this room and then head down through this floor door to escape. I do like the chase section with Huggy we did get in the final version, but I think this would have been really cool too. Although there are definitely some sections which appear to be relatively similar, I think it's really interesting to see this original layout of the factory and see just how different the experience might have been. We saw some ideas reworked into Chapter 2, but hopefully we see more of these ideas implemented in future chapters. And lastly, before we wrap things up, another small oddity I found when revisiting some of the unused test maps is that in the Huggy Wuggy reveal map, which has that awesome T-posing model of Huggy chasing the player around, found hidden in the room which Huggy comes out of, every few seconds a box will fly across the room onto the floor on the right here. I have no idea why this happens or what the intention of these boxes was, but yeah, I just thought this was super strange. Alright, and now a little bit of bonus content for this compilation video. Since my last video, a few more things have been found, but not really enough to warrant another standalone video, so I figured I might as well just throw them in here. So in my videos, we talked a lot about the original plan for Poppy Playtime Chapter 1, and how it's believed that originally the plan might have been for the player to drive up and actually start outside of the Playtime Co. factory. Well, a few more unused models have surfaced to support this. First, there are some grass assets that obviously would have been seen outdoors, and then in addition to the one car we already covered in a previous video, there's also this early placeholder car model. Also in my previous videos, we've seen the unused baby head factory room. Well, some unused models have been found that seem to be related to it as well. And these are unused models of the top and bottom of a mold for those baby heads. So I guess in addition to this room where the heads are already made, it looks like there might have been plans to see the making of these heads from an even earlier process stage. Now, although we didn't see these implemented yet into the unused version of the map, there's this model of some sinks that appear to have been meant for these bathrooms, and there's also these steps featuring an awesome design that would have been meant for the theater room we also discussed in a previous video. Then next up, there are some models for a tower as well as some walls. Now these appear to be the ones that were used for the unused version of the title screen, but nothing like this ever ends up in the final. And speaking of things that are never seen in the final version, there's also this unused model for a wall elevator. No elevators are ever seen in the final version of Chapter 1, so I don't really know where this could have been meant to be used. Then, in addition to this large unused crayon that, based on the file name, would have been a column for something, there's also several models meant for a crane. These include some glass, as well as a play and stop button. Now, this glass model is actually still found under the room where you find the red hand. So it appears that perhaps initially the plan was for the player to actually control the crane in this room to grab the red hand container instead of it just being automatic. And there's actually even some animation data left over in the game to support this as well. And lastly, for the unused models here, we also got this unused keycard panel, which I assume might have been an early version of the code panel used here, and then there's also an unused model of a sliding door, perhaps meant for the entrance to the facility. And now lastly for this long video, shoutouts to you if you made it this far. I seriously can't believe how much unused content there is in this game. But anyways, there's actually another normally unused room found left over in the game listed as Toy Sorting Room. Now this room features some more baby heads as well as several conveyor belts that I guess would be doing the sorting here. And interestingly, this room actually still fits into the final layout of the map here, and it looks like this may have originally been where you would have ended up after completing this power puzzle after getting the red hand. So instead of proceeding on this conveyor belt all the way here to the Make a Toy room, it looks like instead you would have been taken to this toy sorting room first, and then you would go through this door and through this hallway, which would then take you to the toy factory. I guess maybe the developers felt this room wasn't necessary and didn't really add anything, so they basically just skipped it altogether to get to the toy making room faster. Anyways, thanks again for watching this video, especially if you watched it all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I will see you in a bit.